In the dead of night, when the northern forests are silent and the wind carries whispers of forgotten gods, a shadow moves unseen. An ancient force stirs, older than empires, hungrier than vengeance itself. And one man, alone, bloodied and bound by an oath, must face it. Will he survive the storm that fate has summoned, or will the shadows claim him before the dawn? Shadows over Skjoldheim, written by Second Hogo. The sea was not a friend, it was a devouring beast, eternal and insatiable. Its waves clawed at the black cliffs with the hunger of wolves, breaking themselves into foam, yet rising again and again, as if they too bore the stubbornness of the north. On these shores, beneath the sky swollen with iron-gray clouds, the village of Skjoldheim clung to existence. The houses, built from rough timber and turf, seemed less dwellings than scars upon the earth, carved by men who refused to bow before storm or frost. Smoke rose from their hearths, bitter with pine resin, mingling with the cries of gulls that circled like restless spirits of the drowned. In the heart of this harshness burned a fire, pride. For they were the wolf sons of the north, the wanderers of the whale road, the chosen of Odin. Their lives were brief, their deaths often violent, but their names, if spoken with enough valor, could outlive centuries. And it was upon such a night, when the wind howled like Fenrir chained in darkness, that destiny set its gaze upon Eirikr, son of Hrothgar, a youth not yet hardened by war, but already shadowed by dreams of greatness.
Behind him the sea roared, before him the unknown waited. The mead hall of Skjoldheim pulsed with life, a cavern of flame and shadow. Torches spat resinous smoke, and the rafters shuddered with the thunder of voices. Songs of battle, laughter that shook like steel against steel, oaths sworn over brimming horns of ale. At the high table sat Hrothgar the Old, chief of the clan. His beard, white as the snows that buried the mountains, spilled upon a chest scarred by 50 winters of war. His eyes were pale, glacial, yet within them lived the relentless flame of a man who had never yielded. Beside him lay his sword, Wolf-biter, its hilt worn smooth by a lifetime of vengeance. It was here, beneath the smoky beams, that the boy Eirikr first felt the weight of his bloodline. Hrothgar's hand fell heavy upon his shoulder, and the hall grew silent. The old chieftain's voice was like a hammer striking an anvil, each word echoing in the marrow of those who heard. Listen, son of mine, we are not born for peace. The sea does not love us, the earth does not feed us, the sky does not shelter us. All we take with iron. The moment you first draw breath, you are sworn to a war that began before you and will outlive you. That is the fate of our kind. Eirikr felt the eyes of warriors upon him, men who had split skulls and burned kingdoms, men whose laughter was heavier than most men's grief. He swallowed his fear, for to tremble was to dishonor his blood. Yet within him a fire flickered, uncertain, restless. Was this fate carved in stone, or could a man shape his own saga? Somewhere beyond the hall, the wind shrieked across the fjord, as if mocking the oaths of mortals. The boy clenched his jaw. He would endure it all, storm, blood, and destiny, for in his veins surged not just life, but legend waiting to be written. The first blow of fate. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to the fjord. It was faint at first, smoke tangled with brine, a bitterness that clung to the nostrils like an omen. The gulls screamed louder, circling in erratic frenzy, as if the sky itself had been disturbed. Eirikr, still restless from the words of his father, stood outside the hall and lifted his head. The night was heavy, the clouds low, yet beneath their cover a faint orange pulse flickered along the far side of the bay. It was fire.
By the time he ran into the hall, breath caught in his chest, the warriors had already noticed. One after another, men rose from their benches, their laughter falling silent, their fists tightening around drinking horns until mead spilt across the rush-strewn floor. Hrothgar the Old did not rise. He merely leaned forward on the haft of his sword, his pale eyes narrowed into slits. The hall had grown so still that even the crackle of torches sounded like distant thunder. "It begins," he said, voice low as a funeral drum. The doors of the hall burst open. A boy no older than Eirikr staggered inside, his tunic scorched, his hair clotted with blood. He fell to his knees, gasping like a fish torn from water. "They come, shields black as night, dragon prows cutting through the mist, our fields burn, our cattle slain." The words tumbled over each other, but the meaning was clear. An enemy long whispered had arrived, the raiders of the south, men who bore no kinship to Odin's sons, men who sought not honor, but plunder. A roar shook the hall, half fury, half exhilaration. Men slammed their fists on the tables, their voices rising in a storm of curses and promises of blood. Already women were fetching spears from the racks, handing blades to husbands, fathers, sons. The hall, once a place of revelry, became a forge where wrath was hammered into resolve. Eirikr felt his veins tremble with a heat both terrifying and intoxicating. He watched his father stand, the weight of his years erased in a heartbeat. Hrothgar's voice rang like iron struck against iron. "To arms, wolf sons of Skjoldheim! The foe dares set fire to our earth, and with it they have kindled the wrath of gods and men alike. Tonight the ravens will feast until their bellies burst." A cheer thundered back, rattling the timbers of the hall. Swords scraped free of sheaths, shields clashed together in rhythm, and the war song began, not sung, but shouted, each syllable a blow against fear. Yet for Eirikr the sound was not enough to drown his thoughts. He had never held a sword in true battle. His arm knew the weight of the blade, but not the resistance of flesh. He had sparred with boys, but never locked eyes with a man intent on killing him. Fear whispered, insidious, threading through the cracks of his resolve. "Will you falter? Will you disgrace your blood?" Before doubt could take root, a hand seized his shoulder. He turned. It was his father, eyes burning with the cold fire of destiny. "Eirikr," said Hrothgar, "tonight you cease to be a child. Tonight you carry our name into the storm. Do not tremble before death. If you meet him, you will sit in Valhalla at my side. If you live, you will carve a saga greater than mine. But falter, and your shame will outlive you." The words fell upon him like a yoke of iron. There was no choice left. He bowed his head, clenched his jaw, and accepted the weight. The march began. Through the village they poured, a tide of steel and leather, shields catching the glow of torchlight, axes gleaming like frozen lightning. The women followed, some to fight, others to drag the wounded, all with eyes that burned no less fiercely than the men. Children clung to doorways, wide-eyed, watching their fathers stride towards fate. The night exploded.
At the far edge of Skjoldheim, flames devoured the huts nearest the fields. Dark figures moved among them, enemies clad in mail, their faces hidden by helms shaped like snarling beasts. Their war cries were guttural, alien, bereft of the poetry that marked the North. They came not as brothers seeking honor, but as carrion crows, eager to tear flesh from the living. Hrothgar gave the signal. A horn bellowed, deep and terrible, and from the darkness the wolf-sun surged. Shields slammed together, forming a wall of iron, spears bristling outward. The ground shook beneath their charge. Eirikr ran with them, lungs aflame, heart pounding as though it sought to leap from his chest. The first clash was thunder made flesh. Spears shattered, axes bit through wood and bone alike. The air filled with the spray of blood and the scream of dying men. Eirikr's world became a blur of motion. Shields crashing, blades flashing, the stench of sweat and iron thick in his nostrils. An enemy lunged at him, sword aimed for his throat. Instinct, not thought, drove him. He raised his shield, the impact ringing through his bones, then thrust his blade forward. He felt resistance, then the sudden collapse of flesh. The men fell. For a heartbeat, he could not breathe. He had killed. The weight of it pressed upon him, heavy as the sea. Then another enemy came, and there was no time for thought, only survival. He struck again and again, each blow carving away the boy he had been.
Around him the battle raged like the storm of Ragnarok itself. Hrothgar stood at the center, his sword wolf-biter singing through the night, each stroke felling a foe. Blood streamed down his arms, but he moved with the fury of a man already promised to Odin. Yet victory was not certain. The enemy pressed hard, their numbers greater than the scouts had warned. Fires consumed more of the village, sparks leaping skyward like the souls of the slain. For every foe cut down, another seems to rise from the smoke. Then it happened. Through the chaos, a figure emerged, a chieftain of the raiders, clad in black mail, his helm wrought in the shape of a serpent. In his hands gleamed a blade unlike any Eirikr had seen, curved and cruel, its edge dripping with the lives it had already claimed. The serpent-helmed locked eyes with Hrothgar. The world seemed to still. Even the clash of battle dimmed, as though the earth itself held its breath. The two leaders advanced, neither rushing, neither faltering, each step the echo of countless sagas before them. Around them men bled and died, but in that circle of fate only two existed. Hrothgar raised Wolf-biter. The serpent chief lowered his helm, blade poised like a fang. And with a roar that shook the heavens, they met. The sea lay before them like an endless gray mirror, restless and unknowable, stretching further than the eyes could chase. Eirikr stood at the prow of the longship, the carved dragon head snarling into the morning wind, foam breaking beneath its wooden jaws. Behind him the men rowed, their oars dipping in solemn rhythm, the chant of effort rising with each pull. The salt clung to their beards, the spray to their cloaks, and in their eyes burned the same hunger that had carried them from Skjoldheim, the hunger for plunder, for song, and for the gods' approval.
Yet Eirikr's gaze was fixed not on the horizon, but within. He carried the dream of the raven still, the voice of Odin whispering like smoke through his thoughts. Every stroke of the oar seemed to echo with it, every cry of the gulls carried it back, blood yet to be spilled, fates yet to be sealed.
He had vowed upon the ashes of his father's hall that he would not falter, but each dawn brought him deeper into a world where shadows ruled. The days of voyage were cruel. The North Sea was no friend, but a beast that tested them with biting winds and waves that clawed at the timbers. More than once a man was lost to the foam, pulled screaming into the depths before any hand could reach him. They did not stop to mourn. There was no time for that, only a moment of silence before the oars bit water again. When, at last, land rose from the horizon, it came as jagged cliffs and green hills smothered in mist. Villages clung to the coast like nests, smoke rising from hearths, unaware of the storm about to break upon them. The long ships slid into inlets with the silence of wolves stalking prey. Then came the fury. Eirikr leapt ashore with the others, his sword singing as it left the scabbard. The first he struck fell with a cry that split the morning. Fire was put to thatch, and in moments the peaceful harbor was a furnace. He moved as though in a fever, cutting, striking, shoving through smoke and flame. His comrades roared like madmen, the clash of steel and the shrieks of the dying mixing into a song too wild to be forgotten. But Eirikr's eyes caught what others ignored. A boy, crouched behind a barrel, clutching a wooden toy. His gaze locked on Eirikr, wide, unblinking. For a heartbeat he was no longer in a foreign land but home. The smoke of his own father's hall thick in his nose, himself a boy staring out into the world ending. His sword trembled. The boy fled. Eirikr let him go.
That night, when the spoils were counted, silver hacked into pieces, cattle driven down to the beach, women and children bound in ropes, Eirikr sat apart. The others laughed and sang, drinking deep from looted mead. But for him, the taste of ash lingered. He thought of his father, of honor, of vengeance, and of the blood on his hands. The gods demanded strength, yet strength was devouring him from within. The raids continued. Each village fell much the same. Steel, fire, cries that echoed long after the wind had died. Eirikr grew into a figure whispered among his foes, the tall warrior with eyes like storm water, striking swift and silent. Yet inside him the weight grew. At night he dreamed of waves swallowing the land, of ravens feeding upon fields of corpses, of his father's voice calling from the mist, urging him onward. Then betrayal struck. One dawn they awoke to find a ship gone, along with Stenvar and a chest heavy with silver. Rage tore through the camp. Men shouted, curses filled the air, blades flashed, trust frayed like rope soaked too long in salt. It was Eirikr who stepped between two warriors about to draw blood, his voice low, steady, warning them that to turn against each other was to hand victory to their enemies unseen. Yet even as peace returned, with mutters and glares, he felt the crack that would never mend. Soon after, the sea itself rose against them. A storm swept in without warning, the sky darkening as though a cloak had been thrown across the sun. Thunder rolled like the drums of war. Waves taller than houses crashed upon them, tearing oars from hands, splintering decks. Men screamed prayers to Thor, to Njörður, to any god who might hear. Lightning cleaved the heavens, and in its white glare Eirikr swore he saw shapes moving beneath the black waves. Vast coils, gleaming eyes, the endless body of Jormungandr itself stirring in the deep. The storm did not relent for a day and a night. When dawn came, half their ships were gone, swallowed whole. The survivors, soaked and broken, crawled upon an alien shore, coughing salt from their lungs. There was no joy in survival, only exhaustion. And then came the spears. The people of that coast were no weaklings. They rushed to meet the intruders with shields locked, spears bristling, voices fierce with the fury of defending their own. The clash was brutal. Eirikr felt his strength return with each strike, his blade biting wood, flesh, iron. Yet as he fought, he saw in their faces the same fire that had burned in his father's men, the same desperation to hold what was theirs. No gods watched this field, only men, alike in fear and rage. When the battle ended, the ground was carpeted with bodies. The air stank of blood and smoke. The Northmen had won, but victory tasted of ash. Their numbers dwindled with every step forward. Each shore brought more blood, more loss, more hollow triumph. And always in the distance lingered the shadow of the serpent-helmed chieftain, the man who had begun it all, whose horde was said to grow in the south like a tide gathering to swallow the world. Eirikr stood that night on the cliff above the sea, the wind tearing at his hair, his sword heavy in his hand. The voices of the fallen whispered in the waves. He had come far, and yet his path had only begun. The gods had marked him, whether for glory or doom he did not know, but he would not turn back. His oath was iron, his vengeance burned still. And so the long road stretched before him, through storm, through blood, through shadow deeper than night. The days that followed were like walking through smoke, half real, half dream. The sea no longer seemed like a road, but a grave that refused to close. The men who survived the storm moved with hollow eyes, as though part of them had been left beneath the waves. Eirikr roared beside them in silence. His hands blistered, his shoulders raw, but his mind burned sharper than ever. He could not let despair gnaw at him. Each breath was a gift of the Norns, each heartbeat another chance to honor his oath. The land they had reached was strange and rich. Dense forests rolled to the horizon, rivers cut the earth like silver threads, and game was plentiful. Yet it was no empty wilderness. The people there were proud, fierce, and quick to defend their ground. Every village stood like a clenched fist, and every fist struck hard.
Skirmishes became endless. No sooner had they burned one hall than another warband descended upon them. Spears rained from the trees, arrows hissed through the undergrowth, axes clashed beneath the canopy where sunlight barely reached. Eirikr learned to fight not only upon open beaches, but in shadows, where roots tripped the careless and silence betrayed the weak. His arms grew calloused, his eyes sharper, his steps more certain. But with each fight, the faces of the fallen multiplied in his memory. He could not forget them. They pressed upon him at night, a silent crowd staring with eyes that asked why. Why them? Why him? Did the gods truly choose him for vengeance, or was he but a pawn upon their board, another life thrown into the great game that none could win? One evening, after a brutal clash by the river, they sat among their dead, too weary to even build a pyre. Eirikr walked apart, down to the water's edge. The moon painted the river in cold light, and upon its surface he saw his reflection, a face gaunt, eyes hollow, the beard of a man grown older than his years. He knelt, scooping water to drink, and for a moment thought he saw another face beside his own, his father's, stern, proud, unyielding. It vanished when he blinked, but the fire it left in his chest did not. The next day brought rumors. From a captive's trembling lips they heard the name of the serpent-helmed chieftain again. He had passed through the land weeks before, gathering men and gold, spreading his banner wide. Villages that resisted were crushed, their warriors nailed to the trees as warnings. The captive spoke of fire-blackened skies, of horns that called through the night like the cries of monsters. He was not merely a raider, they said, but a storm sweeping southward. The word struck Eirikr like the edge of a blade. This was no phantom, no half-remembered enemy. The man who had destroyed Skjoldheim walked the earth still, closer than ever. Every step forward was a step toward him. The fire in his veins flared, burning away his weariness. His comrades saw the change, the way his back straightened, the way his eyes glinted with renewed purpose. They whispered among themselves that perhaps he was indeed touched by the gods, marked for something beyond mere plunder.
Their journey dragged them inland, away from the sea's breath. The forests closed in, damp and dark, filled with the cries of unseen beasts. The men grew restless, unmoored from the sound of waves. They fought more war bands, bled more into the soil, left cairns for the fallen. Supplies grew thin. Hunger carved at their bellies, and quarrels sparked like flint. Eirikr held them together, his voice steady, reminding them that only unity kept them alive. But he felt the strain, the threads fraying with each mile. One night, when rain lashed down and their fire sputtered low, a man named Skjold rose in anger. He accused Eirikr of leading them to doom, of chasing ghosts while the men starved. Words became shouts, shouts became drawn blades. The camp roared with fury as men circled, divided, ready to spill brothers' blood. Eirikr did not flinch. He stepped into the circle, his sword still sheathed, his eyes locked on Skjold's. "You think I lead you astray," he said, his voice low but carrying. "You think I chase shadows. But I chase the one who burned our homes, who slew our kin. Will you abandon vengeance? Will you let your father's bones lie unavenged in the ashes of Skjoldheim? If so, strike me now." The silence that followed was heavy. Rain pattered like drums. Skjold's blade wavered, his breath ragged, but his arm fell. None moved against Eirikr. The circle broke. The fire sputtered, but in their eyes burned a fragile spark of faith once more. As the days bled into weeks, the land changed again. The forests thinned, giving way to rolling plains where grass bent like waves beneath the wind. Here, battles grew larger, more brutal. Whole clans rode against them, mounted warriors with long spears and iron helms, their horses swift as the storm. The Norsemen fought like wolves, backs to each other, shields locked, blades biting at legs and riders alike. The ground shook with hooves, blood churned into mud, cries split the sky. Eirikr learned the rhythm of mounted war, striking low, dragging riders from their saddles, shattering skulls upon stone. He bore wounds, but pressed on, his will harder than iron. The men looked to him now without question, for he no longer seemed merely one among them, but the very will of vengeance given flesh. But still, each night when the camp lay quiet, he felt the weight return. His sword lay at his side, heavy with memory. He wondered how many more lives must be spent before his oath was fulfilled. How many rivers of blood must he wade before the gods were satisfied? And always, in the wind, in the fire's crackle, he thought he heard the whisper of ravens, circling ever closer.
The plains stretched endlessly, golden under the sun, cruel under the storm. For weeks the Northmen pressed deeper into this vastness, each day a battle, each night a test of endurance. Their numbers had dwindled, yet those who remained were tempered like steel, forged by loss and fire. Among them, Eirikr walked at the front, his shadow long, his eyes distant, as though guided by unseen threads. It was during these marches that the stories of him began to spread. Captives whispered his name in fear. Traders spoke of him in hushed tones. The storm-eyed wolf, they called him. He had become more than man in their tales. a figure who struck like thunder and vanished into the horizon. Yet to himself he remained a son, bound by oath, hollowed by grief. One dusk, as the camp settled on a ridge, Eirikr climbed alone to a hill where the wind scoured the earth clean. The horizon burned with red, as if the gods themselves had smeared blood across the sky. He closed his eyes and listened. The wind carried faint cries, perhaps of wolves, perhaps of spirits, and beneath it all, the whisper of ravens, circling, circling. He opened his eyes to find a wanderer before him. Cloaked in gray, hood low over his face, the man leaned on a staff as though age had bent him. His one eye gleamed like an ember in shadow. "You walk far from home, son of Skjoldheim," the stranger voiced, rough with centuries. Eirik's hand fell to his sword. "Who speaks my name?" The wanderer smiled thin as a knife. "I speak only what the threads allow. You chase vengeance, yet vengeance is a wolf it devours more than it feeds. Will you master it, or will it master you?" Before Eirikr could answer, the wind rose, the ravens cried, and the wanderer was gone. Only a feather lay upon the stone, black as night. Eirikr picked it up, his hand trembling. He knew then the gods watched, though whether as allies or mockers he could not say. He tucked the feather into his cloak and returned to his men, saying nothing of what he had seen. The following days brought new trials. They crossed rivers swollen with rain, their currents fierce enough to drag oxen beneath. Men drowned, supplies were lost, yet they pressed on. Hunger gnawed, wounds festered, and still they marched. Their laughter had grown rare, their songs muted, but their eyes shone with the stubborn fire of those who refuse death's embrace. Then came the great clash upon the wide plain, where banners of 100 foes gathered like storm clouds. The Northmen stood outnumbered 5-1, their shields a wall too thin, their hearts beating against fate itself. The horn sounded. Riders thundered forward, spears glittering, voices rising in a wave of fury. Eirikr raised his blade, shouting, not for plunder, not for gold, but for Skjoldheim, for the fathers and brothers who lay in ash. His voice cut through the storm of hooves, and his men roared in answer. The battle was like no other. Steel rang against steel. Arrows fell like rain. The earth shook beneath the weight of war. Eirikr fought in the center, his blade a storm, his shield splintered, his body bloodied. Time lost meaning. There was only the next blow, the next breath, the next heartbeat between life and death.
Weeks of travel followed, each day carving deeper lines into their faces. They passed through villages emptied by fear, homes abandoned, fields left untended. The shadow of the serpent-helmed chieftain lay heavy across the land. His passage was marked by ruin. Men nailed to gates, charred timbers, silence where once there had been song. The people whispered of him as of a plague, a storm that consumed all. Eirikr felt the distance closing. The whispers grew clearer. They spoke of a host gathering in the south, warriors sworn to the serpent banner, drawn by promises of gold and power. The chieftain was more than raider. He was becoming king in all but name, his reach stretching like the coils of Jormungandr. At night, Eirikr dreamed of his father, always the same. The old man standing in the ashes of Skjoldheim, eyes burning, voice silent. He would lift his hand, pointing ever forward, and Eirikr would wake with his chest tight, his breath ragged, the taste of smoke still in his mouth. He spoke of these dreams to no one. They were his alone, a burden too heavy to share. Hunger worsened. They hunted in the wilds, but game grew scarce. Their boots wore thin, their cloaks hung in tatters, yet still they marched. When quarrels rose, Eirikr's voice cut them short.
His authority no longer came from strength alone, but from the weight of his oath, from the belief that he would lead them to an end worth dying for. Then came the village by the Black River. Unlike others, it was not abandoned. Warriors stood at its edge, shields raised, banners whipping in the wind. They bore the mark of the serpent. The clash was brutal. These were no farmers with spears, but hardened men, drilled and ruthless. The serpent's banner loomed above them, and their voices carried his name like a war cry. Eirikr met them head-on, his sword flashing, his shield shattering under the rain of blows. His men fought with the desperation of wolves cornered by fire. For hours they battled, the river banks slick with blood, the cries of the dying drowned by the roar of steel. Eirikr cut through foes with grim fury, each strike a step closer to the man he sought. But the chieftain himself was not there, only his shadow, his servants, his banner taunting in the wind. When at last the enemy broke and fled, the survivors of Eirikr's band were scarcely 30 strong. From the 100 who had once set sail from Skjoldheim, they were all that remained. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, yet within them burned the same fire that had carried them through storm and battle. That night, as they sat beside the Black River, Eirikr spoke out loud what had long burned in his chest.
"We are few," he said, his voice hoarse but unyielding. "But we are not broken. The serpent-helmed thinks himself a king. He spreads his shadow, but he has not yet faced the storm of Skjoldheim's vengeance. We will find him. We will strike at his heart. Let the gods witness it. Let the ravens feast on him as they feasted on our kin." The men listened, silent, their faces lit by firelight. Some nodded, some clenched their fists, some wept. But in their eyes, for the first time in many days, there was something beyond despair, a glimmer, faint yet fierce, of purpose. Eirikr looked into the flames, the feather of the wanderer still hidden in his cloak. He felt the weight of the gods upon him, the gaze of fate unblinking. He did not know if he would live to see the serpent-helmed fall, but he knew he would not turn back. His oath was carved deeper than bone. His road stretched forward, ever forward, into shadow and storm. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the serpent waited. The march southward dragged into months. The land changed, the forests thinning into wide fields, the fields giving way to hills carved with stone ruins older than any tongue could name. The men whispered of giants once walking here, of gods leaving their marks upon the earth. To Eirikr, every shadow spoke of memory, every ruin of blood yet to be spilled. The band had grown lean, stripped to bone and will. They moved like shades through villages, taking what they needed, leaving no more than silence behind. The serpent-helmed was always just ahead, his shadow stretching further, his banners seen and gone like a phantom on the horizon. He was no man, the whispers claimed, but a monster. His helm fused to his skull, his eyes serpent's eyes that saw through the dark. The men listened, fear gnawing, but Eirikr's jaw only hardened. Whether man or beast, his blade would taste the serpent's blood. One evening they came upon a hall, burned black, its roof fallen, its stones still warm from flame. Among the ruins, a single old woman sat, her hair white as frost, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She looked upon Eirikr without fear. "You follow death," she said, her voice thin yet strong, "and death follows you. The one you seek leaves nothing but ash.
You will find him only at the world's edge, where the serpent coils and waits." Eirikr stepped closer. "Tell me where." The woman smiled, toothless, ageless. "North or south, it matters little. All roads lead to the same place. But beware, the gods test not the weak, but the strong. And you, son of Skjoldheim, are strong indeed." When he blinked, she was gone, as if swallowed by the smoke. Only a charred feather lay where she had sat, black and brittle. Eirikr took it, though his hands shook.
The weeks that followed carved deeper into them. Hunger gnawed, wounds festered, yet the men clung to him as to a mast in storm. They crossed mountains where snow blinded the eyes, rivers that froze their very bones, valleys where wolves' howls echoed all night. In each trial they bled, but still they marched. Eirikr bore the weight of their trust, though each step felt heavier, each night longer. At last they reached a wide valley where thousands of fires glimmered in the dark. A host gathered there, greater than any they had yet faced, banners rising like a forest of spears. At its heart, upon a hill crowned with black tents, the serpent banner rippled against the night sky. The men of Eirikr's band looked upon it in silence. Some trembled, some clenched their fists. All knew what it meant. To step forward was to face death itself. Eirikr stood before them, the wind lashing his hair, the feather of the wanderer clutched in his fist. His voice rose above the firecrack and the murmur of fear. "We are few," he said, his words sharp as steel, "but our fathers watch us, our brothers wait in the halls beyond. We have walked through storm, through hunger, through shadow. We have bled until the earth itself knows our maims. Shall we falter now when the serpent wakes before us? No! We strike, and if we fall as wolves, not as sheep." A murmur rose, then a roar, fierce and unbroken. For a moment they were not 30 men, but a host, bound not by numbers, but by oath. That night, as they sharpened blades and bound wounds, Eirikr walked alone to the edge of the hill. The valley stretched below him, endless fires flickering like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere among them, the serpent-helmed lived and breathed. Eirikr closed his eyes. He felt the weight of the gods upon him, the whisper of ravens, the shadow of his father's hall. He did not know if dawn would see him alive, but dawn would see him strike. And so the saga reached its threshold, a handful of men against a tide, a sun against the shadow that had stolen his world. The wind carried the cries of ravens already circling, eager for the feast to come.
Eirikr opened his eyes to the dark. His hand rested upon his sword. His oath was iron, unbroken. Tomorrow the serpent would hear his name. The night before the storm was heavy with silence. The valley of fires stretched below, thousands of flames licking at the dark, each one a beacon of the enemy that waited. The men of Eirikr's band sat in a circle, sharpening their blades by trembling hands, binding the last of their wounds with cloth already stiff from blood. They had no feast, no mead, only cold water and the gnawing hunger of men who had walked too long on roads of ash. Yet in their eyes flickered a light, a fierce reflection of their leader's resolve. Eirikr stood apart, upon a ridge from which he could see the serpent banner whip and writhe in the wind. His sword lay across his knees, his hand resting on the hilt. He thought of his father's hall, now nothing but smoke and bone. He thought of his brothers, their laughter drowned by the roar of flames. He thought of the raven feather in his cloak, the sign of a destiny he had not chosen, yet could not escape.
Sleep did not come. When dawn bled across the sky, he rose without a word, and the 30 men rose with him. They moved down into the valley like shadows made flesh. The serpent's host was already stirring. Drums thundered, horns blared, and the ground shook beneath the march of countless boots. Shields locked into a wall of iron, spears bristling like a forest. At their head, upon a black horse armored in steel, rode the chieftain himself, the serpent-helmed. His helm glistened in the light, wrought into the shape of coiling fangs, and from its eye sockets gleamed a pale, inhuman fire. His voice carried across the valley, deep and venomous, promising slaughter. Eirikr raised his sword. "For Skjoldheim!" he cried, his voice breaking the morning stillness like thunder. "For the fallen! For the oath!" The 30 roared, and they charged. The clash was like worlds colliding. Eirikr's men struck the shield wall with a fury born not of numbers, but of desperation. Spears splintered, axes bit through wood, and blood sprayed in the first breath of battle. Eirikr led them, his sword flashing, his shield breaking beneath a rain of blows. Every strike he gave was the memory of a brother. Every enemy that fell was a stone lifted from his heart.
Yet they were 30 against hundreds. The shield wall swallowed them, pressed them from all sides. Men fell screaming, dragged down beneath waves of steel. Still they fought, carving a path through the horde, driven by the storm that had carried them across sea and land. Eirikr's blade found captains, men who barked orders beneath serpent banners. He cut them down without pause, his arms heavy with blood, his breath ragged. Around him his band dwindled, yet their fury did not. They fought like wolves hemmed by fire, teeth bared, knowing only the next strike, the next heartbeat. At last, through the storm of bodies, Eirikr saw him. The serpent-helmed rode among his men, his voice commanding, his sword carving crimson arcs. Their eyes met across the chaos, one burning with vengeance, the other with cold, merciless pride. Eirikr roared and surged forward, his men forming a wedge behind him. They cut through the last line of spears, broke the circle of shields, and crashed into the serpent's guard. The serpent-helmed dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace. He stood taller than any man, his helm gleaming, his sword broad as a wolf's jaw. His voice carried over the din. "Son of Skjoldheim," he said, the words curling like smoke. "At last you crawl from your grave." Eirikr spat blood. "I crawl to drag you into it." The two closed, the storm of battle falling away, as though the world itself bent to witness their clash. Steel rang against steel, each blow a mountain shattering, each parry a tempest held at bay. Sparks flew, blood mingled with sweat, the ground beneath their feet churned into mud. The serpent-helmed fought with the weight of 100 battles, his strikes precise, merciless, overwhelming. Eirikr met him with fury raw and unbroken, each swing a memory, each cry a vow. The men around them fell, locked in duels of their own, but neither warrior looked away.
The serpent's blade bit deep into Eirikr's side, blood pouring hot and thick. Pain blinded him, but he held fast, his grip unyielding. He struck back, his sword carving across the serpent's shoulder, shattering steel, drawing the first crimson from beneath the helm. A roar rose from both armies, half in triumph and half in rage. The serpent staggered, but did not fall. His helm gleamed, his eyes burned brighter. "You are strong," he hissed, "but strength breaks, as did your kin, as will you." Eirikr answered with silence. His breath was fire, his vision red, his limbs heavy as stone. Yet within him burned the oath, deeper than pain, older than fear. He raised his sword once more. The final clash was thunder. Steel met steel, shattered. For a heartbeat, both men stood locked, faces inches apart, breath mingling. Then Eirikr drove forward with all that remained, his blade piercing beneath the serpent's helm, tearing through flesh and shadow alike. The serpent-helmed let out a cry that was not wholly human, a sound of rage and something darker, of a curse unbound. He fell, his helm striking the earth, his blood soaking into the mud of the valley. For a moment, silence. Then the serpent's host broke. Men fled, banners fell, drums ceased. The 30 were fewer still, broken and bloodied, but they stood. The raven cry filled the sky, black wings descending upon the field. Eirikr fell to one knee, his sword still buried in the body of his foe, his vision blurred, his breath shallow. Around him his brothers gathered, their faces pale with awe and grief. The serpent was dead, the oath fulfilled. Yet in the wind Eirikr heard a whisper, a voice that was not the serpent's, but older, darker, echoing from the depths of fate itself. The tale is not ended, the shadow stirs still. He lifted his head to the sky, ravens circling above. His blood poured upon the earth, but his heart beat steady, unbroken. The gods had claimed their due, but not yet his life. And so the saga turned, the serpent slain, the oath carved into legend, yet beyond the horizon, new storms gathered.
The world would remember the name Eirikr of Skjoldheim. The valley, once alive with fire and fury, lay silent under a gray dawn. Smoke curled from scattered huts, and the blood-soaked earth steamed in the morning chill. Ravens circled above, voices harsh, demanding, echoing across the plain like the lament of the fallen. Eirikr's sword was still in the serpent-helm's body, heavy with heat and life-blood, and yet he did not rise immediately. The silence pressed upon him, thick and unyielding, heavier than any foe he had faced. Around him his men moved slowly, some clutching the dying, some staring blankly at the horizon, at the scattered banners, at the faces of those they had killed. 30 men had marched into the valley, and fewer now remained, broken, weary, bloodied, yet alive. Survival had become a cruel twin to victory, a reminder that to win was not to be whole. Eirikr finally lifted himself to his feet, the weight of his blade dragging at his shoulders. The wind carried the stench of iron and smoke, the cries of the wounded, the whisper of the ravens ever circling. He gazed upon the fallen serpent-helmed, the one who had stolen so much from his life. Even in death, the chieftain's presence seemed to linger, a shadow that refused to dissipate. "It is done!" Hrwald's voice broke the silence, hoarse, trembling, yet curious. He stood at Eirikr's side, eyes scanning the carnage. Eirikr did not answer at once. He could not. He had expected triumph, but the victory felt hollow, the silence oppressive. The faces of those they had slain, the cries that had once filled the valley, haunted him. He knelt, touching the earth where the serpent had fallen. Blood soaked into the soil like a promise, and he felt the oath fulfilled, yet incomplete. "It is done," he said at last, his voice low but steady. "The serpent has fallen, but the world remains." Weeks passed as they gathered what remained of their band, burying the dead, tending the wounded, salvaging what provisions they could. Villages previously terrorized by the serpent-helmed began to emerge from fear, their people wary yet alive. Some offered gifts, food, shelter, knowledge of paths forward. Others remained silent, distrust etched into their faces. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that a new force had shifted, yet uncertain what it would bring. Eirikr walked among them often, silent, observing, listening.
He had expected gratitude, songs sung in his name, perhaps even awe, but found none. Instead, he felt a weight of responsibility pressing upon him. Every life saved, every village spared now bore a debt, and every debt weighed upon his conscience the same way the blood of the fallen haunted his dreams. The raven feather remained tucked in his cloak, a token of the wanderer's warning. Its black surface seemed to absorb the light, a reminder that the god's eyes watched ever close. In its silence, he felt both comfort and warning. The path forward was fraught not only with foes, but with choices that would shape not only him, but the fate of all who followed.
The men spoke less now. Words seemed inadequate. They moved in careful coordination, each step measured, each breath a reminder that the world had changed. Where once they had chased vengeance like a wildfire, now they walked in the shadow of it, cautious, aware, haunted by memory. Eirik's own dreams were no longer filled with visions of fire and storm, but of faces, his father's, his brother's, the boy he had spared long ago, blended with the eyes of the serpent-helmed. In these visions he walked roads that twisted endlessly, corridors of shadow where every turn brought both hope and dread. The whisper of ravens was constant, ever closer, and he knew that the end of one chapter was only the beginning of another. By the end of the month, they had reached a high plateau overlooking the sea once more. The horizon stretched endlessly, waves crashing against jagged rocks far below. Eirikr stood at the edge, his cloak whipping in the wind, sword sheathed, hands clasped upon the hilt. He felt the enormity of what had been achieved, yet also the vastness of what lay ahead. The gods had tested him, fate had bent him, and yet he remained standing. Not victorious, not whole, but unbroken. "This is not the end," he whispered to the wind, the raven feather pressing against his chest. "It is merely the turning of a page. The world is not yet ready for peace, and neither am I." Behind him, his men gathered, faces tired, bodies scarred, eyes reflecting both fear and awe. They had survived storms, betrayal, hunger, and death itself, yet now they faced a new truth. The road forward was uncertain, the choices heavier, and the price of each step yet unseen. As the sun set behind the horizon, painting the sea with gold and fire, Eirikr gazed toward the distant lands that waited. Somewhere beyond, new threats stirred, new shadows lengthened, and new trials awaited. The oath that had carried him thus far would guide him still, but the shape of destiny itself began to twist. The ravens circled overhead, black wings casting fleeting shadows across the plateau. Eirik's heart beat steady, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The serpent-helmed was dead, but the world had not yet revealed its final face. The story was far from over, and the journey of Skjoldheim's son had only begun anew. He turned to his men. "We have survived, we have endured, and we will endure still. But remember, fate watches, and it is patient." The wind carried his words across the plateau, into the valleys, into the sea, and perhaps to ears unseen. Eirikr of Skjoldheim had faced the serpent. He had survived the storm, and now he would face the world and whatever destiny the gods had yet to reveal.
The days that followed the serpent's fall were not filled with joy, nor with relief. The land remained scarred, and the faces of the fallen haunted Eirik's waking hours. Each morning he rose to find the sky gray, the wind carrying whispers from valleys and forests alike. The oath he had fulfilled pressed upon him, not lighter, but heavier, as if the act of vengeance had unlocked yet another measure of fate. He wandered often alone, away from the camp, through forests where the shadows moved like living things. He spoke little, listened more, and in the quiet of the trees he felt the weight of all he had survived. Waves of memory washed over him. His father's voice, the crackle of Skjoldheim burning, the faces of men he had led to death and glory alike. He questioned himself, the choices he had made, the path that stretched endlessly before him. At night, the dreams returned, but they were not the visions of battle now. There were corridors of choice, hallways of shadow, where each door opened onto a different outcome. In some, he was victorious, but alone. In others, his men were alive, but the serpent-helmed remained. In yet others, he himself was claimed by the very vengeance he had sought. He would awaken, his chest tight, the raven feather pressed to his heart, and wonder if the gods had ever intended him to stand at all. Roald approached him one evening, eyes weary, carrying the weight of unspoken questions. "Eirikr," he said, voice low, "we survived, yet I see your gaze far away, beyond the horizon, as though the battles behind us are smaller than those yet to come. Tell me, do you fear what is ahead?" Eirikr's hands rested on his sword, the leather worn, the steel dulled from the blood and storms. "Fear is simple. It is what keeps a man alive. What gnaws at me is the path of choice, the cost of each action. I have taken lives, fulfilled oaths, and yet I feel the shadow of consequence growing, patient, waiting for a crack in my resolve." The men moved cautiously through villages that were rebuilding, sometimes met with gratitude, sometimes suspicion. Children stared at them, eyes wide, sensing the ghost that clung to their forms. Elders whispered of vengeance and God's will. Eirikr walked among them like a specter, silent, observing, measuring each step. He knew that every action now bore meaning far beyond survival or victory. Every choice could tilt the balance of life and death for countless others.
In the nights that followed, he began to test himself. He would stand at cliffs overlooking the sea, feeling the wind tear at his cloak, imagining what it would mean to step beyond, to surrender entirely to fate. Yet he did not. Each time he turned back to his men, the oath burning brighter in his chest than despair. The gods may have watched, and destiny may have weighed heavily, but Eirikr's will remained his own, fragile, yes, but unbroken. One morning, a rider appeared on the horizon. Dust rose in spirals as he approached. He carried no banner, no cry, only a message etched in haste. New forces gathered in the north. Tribes of men who had fled the serpent's shadow now coalescing, bound by fear and promises of vengeance. They would challenge Eirikr and his band, and perhaps even the fragile peace that had followed the serpent's fall. The men gathered to hear the news, their faces hardening. The oath had kept them alive, yet it had not yet ended. The shadow of war stretched longer than the eye could see, and its darkness was patient. Eirikr's mind turned inward as much as outward. He had conquered one monster, but he faced another, the relentless tide of responsibility, the unyielding weight of survival, the question of what it meant to lead, to choose, to endure. Every decision now carried the imprint of life and death, not only for him, but for the men who had trusted him with their lives. That night, he knelt beside the fire alone,
the raven feather pressed to his chest. Flames danced across the plateau, their light painting his face in flickering relief and shadow. He whispered to the wind, to the gods, to whatever force watched over the world. "I have walked through fire and death, through storm and shadow. I have fulfilled my oath, yet the road stretches ever onward. Let fate test me, let the gods weigh me, but I will not falter. For every life in my hands, for every soul that follows me, I will endure. I will choose. I will decide. I will stand." The wind stirred, carrying the cries of ravens, the murmur of distant forests, the promise of trials yet unseen. Eirikr rose, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. The serpent-helmed was dead, yet destiny itself had not loosened its grasp. The world waited, patient and relentless, and Eirikr knew that his true journey had only begun.